palace didn't fall with a scream, it collapsed in silence. Behind the iron gates of Buckingham Palace, something unthinkable happened, and by the time the world realized it, the damage was already done. This wasn't rumor. This wasn't speculation. This was confirmation. A devastating truth dropped without warning, tearing straight through centuries of royal composure and leaving the monarchy exposed in a way no one alive had ever seen before. The words hit like a blow to the chest. Not dramatic, not embellished, just cold, brutal reality. Something unimaginable had occurred inside Buckingham Palace, and the royal family itself had confirmed it. No leaks, no gradual buildup, just a sudden, irreversible moment that left Britain stunned and the rest of the world frozen in disbelief. For generations, the palace has sold one promise above all else: stability. A sense that no matter what chaos raged outside those walls, the monarchy would stand unshaken. But that illusion cracked instantly, because this time, the disturbance didn't come from politics or scandal or rebellion. It came from inside the family itself, and it was devastating enough to silence the palace machine. The morning began like any other. Quiet, orderly, deceptively normal. The sun rose over Buckingham Palace, casting that familiar golden glow across the courtyard. Staff moved through corridors trained by decades of routine. But something was wrong. Phones rang too early. Meetings vanished without explanation. Senior aides stopped smiling. Whispers followed every step, cutting off abruptly whenever someone approached. By mid-morning, tension had settled thick in the air. Messages weren't emailed, they were delivered face-to-face. Doors closed. The communications team disappeared behind locked offices. Outside the gates, reporters sensed it immediately. Security vehicles arrived in clusters. Guards shifted positions without orders being announced. Side entrances, rarely used, suddenly became active. Something serious had happened. Something big enough to disrupt the palace's iron discipline. By noon, the whispers reached the press. Not facts, fragments. One correspondent described it as deeply troubling. Another called it a significant internal development. Within minutes, speculation detonated online. Social media flooded with theories so wild even seasoned royal watchers refused to repeat them. For once, nobody knew what was happening, and that uncertainty terrified people. Then it happened. Without warning, the royal website went offline. Seconds later, it returned. Black text, white background, the royal crest. No photographs, no explanations. Just a statement so brief it felt almost cruel, acknowledging a deeply distressing and heartbreaking development within the royal family, expressing sorrow, asking for privacy, offering nothing else. No names, no causes, no timeline, just grief. The impact was immediate and explosive. Television networks cut into programming. Anchors struggled to maintain composure. Phones buzzed across schools, offices, and homes. People stopped what they were doing mid-movement just to read the words themselves. Outside Buckingham Palace, crowds began forming almost instinctively, as if pulled by gravity. Faces were pale. Conversations were hushed. Guards stood perfectly still, but the silence around them had changed. This wasn't discipline anymore. This was mourning. Inside the palace, the atmosphere turned suffocating. Long-serving staff, people who had seen abdications, funerals, wars, and scandals, whispered that they had never felt anything like it. Corridors, once alive with murmured coordination, stretched endlessly quiet. Some staff were quietly dismissed. Others told to remain in place indefinitely. Meals went untouched. Clocks sounded louder than usual. By evening, the story had escaped Britain entirely. From Washington to Sydney, headlines echoed the same haunting phrase, tragedy in the palace. Yet Buckingham Palace offered nothing more. No clarification, no follow-up, just silence. And that silence spoke volumes. When the statement appeared online again later that day, the tone felt different, raw, human, trembling beneath carefully chosen words. This wasn't the palace speaking from protocol. This was a family in shock. The monarchy, a fortress built on emotional restraint, had cracked just enough for the world to see something terrifyingly real. Outside the gates, mourning began to take physical form. Flowers appeared first, then photographs, then candles. People arrived without knowing exactly why they needed to be there, only that they did. Some cried openly. Others stood frozen, staring at the palace windows as if answers might suddenly appear. Daily life across Britain stalled. Shops paused transactions. Teachers abandoned lesson plans. Strangers exchanged the same whispered question, "Have you heard?" Church bells began tolling, not by command, but by instinct. From London cathedrals to rural chapels, the sound rolled across the country, binding cities and villages in shared grief. Social media exploded. Names of senior royals trended worldwide within minutes. Messages poured in from celebrities, politicians, and ordinary citizens alike. Disbelief. Shock. Photos of happier days reposted like fragile reminders of a time that suddenly felt distant. As night fell, the crowd outside Buckingham Palace swelled. Candles flickered in the wind, wax pooled over stone. Flowers piled so high they began spilling onto the road. Elderly couples held hands in silence. Parents lifted children onto shoulders, whispering that this was history, tragic, irreversible history. Inside the palace walls, grief was no longer contained. Emergency meetings were held behind closed doors. Senior royals gathered beneath cold chandeliers, faces drawn and pale. Advisors spoke, but no one had solutions. The king sat motionless, gaze fixed downward. Words had abandoned him. Decades of discipline and composure meant nothing in the face of this loss. Elsewhere, Prince William moved through the day like a man underwater. Those closest to him noticed it immediately. The familiar steadiness was gone. He focused on his children, shielding them from cameras and chaos, but the strain was visible. Princess Kate stayed close, anchoring the family through sheer resolve, even as exhaustion etched itself across her face. As darkness settled over London, palace lights dimmed one by one. The king withdrew from briefings. The prince and princess disappeared from view. Buckingham Palace, once the symbol of unshakable endurance, had become something else entirely. A house in mourning. And the world, locked outside its gates, could feel it. By the next morning, Britain woke up changed. Not because the palace had spoken again, it hadn't, but because silence had grown louder than any announcement ever could. The Union Jack hung at half-mast, unmoving, as if even the wind understood this was not a day for noise. Newspapers sold out before noon. Front pages carried the same restrained words, but beneath them, everyone knew the truth. This was not routine mourning. This was something that had cracked the monarchy at its core. Inside Buckingham Palace, time stopped behaving normally. Corridors stretched longer. Rooms felt heavier. The usual hum of coordination, aides, planners, courtiers vanished. What remained was an atmosphere so dense with grief that even footsteps sounded intrusive. Staff moved slowly, carefully, as if any sudden sound might shatter what little composure remained. The king faced an impossible collision. Crown versus blood, duty versus loss. Advisors urged him to address the nation again, to steady the country, to reassure a public desperate for grounding. Draft after draft crossed his desk, formal, polished, distant. One by one, he rejected them. They sounded like a monarch speaking, but he no longer felt like one. Late that evening, alone in his study, he crossed out entire paragraphs and rewrote them himself. Shorter, simpler, honest. When the cameras finally rolled, the room was silent enough to hear breathing. He wore black. His hands were clasped tighter than protocol allowed. And when he spoke, it wasn't from the throne, it was from the wound. He admitted there were no words for this kind of sorrow. He thanked the public, not as subjects, but as fellow human beings. And then he said the line that stunned the nation, that in the end, even kings are human. Across Britain, living rooms fell silent. Pubs muted televisions. Families sat shoulder to shoulder, absorbing the reality that the monarchy and institution built on endurance was openly grieving. When the address ended, there was no applause, only stillness. Outside the palace gates, thousands stood in the cold, candles trembling in their hands. His words hadn't healed the nation, but they had done something else. They had stripped away distance. The crown no longer felt untouchable. It felt heartbreakingly close. In the days that followed, questions began to surface. Quietly at first, not cruel questions, human ones. What had happened? What kind of loss could silence a family trained never to break? The palace confirmed only this: it was not scandal, not politics, not power. It was personal, devastatingly personal. Those close to the family spoke of warning signs that now felt painfully obvious. Public appearances growing shorter, smiles tightening, energy fading. Prince William, once the picture of controlled resolve, had appeared distant for weeks. Princess Kate, normally radiant with composure, moved carefully, conserving strength. Inside the palace, the grief spread like a shadow. Senior aides broke down in private rooms. Long-serving staff wept in silence. Guards stood straighter than ever, their stillness now heavy with meaning. This tragedy hadn't just struck the family. It had shaken everyone who served them, and the public understood. There was no outrage, no feeding frenzy, no hunger for spectacle. Instead, something rare happened. Compassion overtook curiosity. Parents who had lost children saw themselves reflected in royal pain. Siblings who had buried loved ones recognized the look in the family's eyes. Titles disappeared. Humanity took their place. Across the United Kingdom, mourning became collective. In Edinburgh, flowers lined palace gates. In Cardiff, bells echoed through narrow streets. In Belfast, Belfast, silent crowds gathered with photographs clutched to their chests. Cathedrals opened their doors. Candles burned day and night. People queued for hours just to sit in stillness. Strangers held hands. Critics of the monarchy stood beside lifelong loyalists, united not by tradition, but by empathy. Conversations shifted. Politics faded. What mattered was loss. Universal, devastating loss. As days passed, the palace remained largely closed off. Prince William and Princess Kate withdrew entirely, focusing on their children away from cameras and expectations. Those close to them said William spent long hours in quiet rooms, staring out at gardens where laughter once echoed. The boy who had walked behind his mother's coffin now carried another grief, this time as a father, a husband, and a future king. For him, this wasn't just mourning. It was a breaking point. Years of pressure, endless scrutiny, the weight of destiny pressing down without pause. When he finally appeared briefly before cameras, his eyes told the story words couldn't. Red, hollow, exposed, no armor left. Kate stood beside him, steady but strained, grounding him with presence alone. When William thanked the public and asked for privacy, it wasn't ceremonial. It was a plea, and the world listened. Behind closed doors, the monarchy faced an uncomfortable reckoning. The tragedy had done what generations of debate never could. It humanized the crown completely. No illusion remained. The question whispered in homes and headlines alike was unavoidable now. What happens next? Some feared this loss would weaken the institution permanently. Others believed it had done the opposite, tearing down walls that never should have existed. The monarchy, once distant and ceremonial, now felt painfully real, fragile, mortal. As nights passed, the sea of flowers outside Buckingham Palace grew higher. Candles burned through rain and wind. Notes written in shaky handwriting spoke of love, grief, and solidarity. Volunteers brought blankets, hot drinks, quiet comfort. The United Kingdom had become one long vigil. Inside the palace, lights stayed dim. Meetings were brief. Words were scarce. Grief had no schedule, no protocol. And yet, beneath the sorrow, something else emerged. Connection. A nation that had watched the monarchy for centuries now mourned with it, not as spectators, but as equals in loss. The crown no longer symbolized distance or perfection. It symbolized endurance through pain. As the palace stood silent against the London sky, one truth settled over the world. Even the mightiest families are not spared heartbreak. And perhaps that was the moment that changed everything. Not the tragedy itself, but the way it revealed what had always been hidden beneath the crown. A family. Vulnerable. Loving. Broken. Human. History will record this as a day of loss. But it may also remember it as the moment the monarchy stopped standing above its people and stood among them instead. Them instead. Them instead. Them instead.